All right. Section 3. Okay. Section 3, the form of value or exchange value. Commodities into the world in the shape of use values, articles or goods such as iron, linen, corn, etc. This is their plan, homely, bodily form. They are, however, commodities only because they are something twofold, both objects of utility and at the same time disputaries of value. They manifest themselves, therefore, as commodities, or have the form of commodities, only in so far as they have two forms, a physical or a natural form, and a value form. The reality of the values of commodities differs in this respect, for damn quickly that we do not know where to have it. The value of commodities is the very opposite of the coarse materiality of their substance. Not an atom of matter enters in this composition. Turn and examine a single commodity by itself as we will, yet in so far as it remains an object of value, it seems impossible to grasp it. If, however, we bear in mind that the value of commodities has a purely social reality and that they acquire this reality only in so far as they are expressions or embodiments of one identical social substance, viz., human labor, it follows as a matter of course that value can only manifest itself in the social relation of commodity to commodity. In fact, we started from exchange value or exchange relations of commodities in order to get at the value that lies hidden behind it. We must now return to this form under which value first appears to us. Everyone knows, if he knows nothing else, that commodities have a value form common to them all, and presenting a marked contrast. Everyone knows, if he knows nothing else, that commodities have a value form common to them all, and presenting a marked contrast with the varied bodily forms of their use values, I mean their money form. Here, however, a task is set to us, the performance of which has never yet ever been attempted by bourgeois economy, the task of tracing the genesis of this money form, of developing the expression of values implied in the value relations of commodities from its simplest form, almost imperceptible outline, to the dazzling money form. By doing this, we shall at the same time solve the riddle presented by money. The simplest value relation is evidently that one commodity to some other commodity of a different kind. Hence, the relation between values of two commodities supplied us with the simplest expression of value of one single commodity. A. Elementary of accidental form of value. X commodity A equal Y commodity B, or X commodity A is worth Y commodity B. 20 yards of linen equal 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat. The whole mystery of the form of value lies hidden in this elementary form. Its analysis, therefore, is our real difficulty. Here, two different kinds of commodities. In our example, the linen and the coat evidently play two different parts. The linen expresses its value in the coat. The coat serves as the material in which that value is expressed. The former plays an active, the latter a passive part. The value of the linen is represented as relative value or appears in relative form. The coat obfuscates as equivalent or appears in equivalent form. The relative form and equivalent form are two intimately connected, mutually dependent, and inseparable elements of the expression of values, but at the same time are mutually exclusive, antagonistic extremes, i.e., poles of the same expression. They are allotted respectively to two different commodities brought into relation by that expression. It is not possible to express the value of different commodities brought into relation by that expression. It is not possible to express the value of linen in linen. 20 yards of linen equal 20 yards of linen is no expression of value. On the contrary, such an equation merely says that 20 yards of linen are nothing else than 20 yards of linen, a definite quantity of equation, merely definite quantity, the use value linen. The value of linen can therefore be expressively only relatively, i.e., in some other commodity. The relative form of the value of linen presupposes, therefore, the presence of some other commodity. Here, the coat under the form of an equivalent. On the other hand, the commodity that figures as the equivalent cannot at the same time assume the relative form. The second commodity is not the one whose value is expressed. Its function is merely to serve as the material in which the value of the first commodity is expressed. No doubt the expression 20 yards of linen equal one coat or 20 yards of linen are worth one coat implies the opposite relation. One coat equal 20 yards of linen or one coat worth 20 yards of linen. But in that case, I must reverse the equation in order to express the value of the coat relatively, and as soon as I do that, linen becomes the equivalent instead of the coat. A single commodity cannot therefore simultaneously assume in the same expression of value both forms. The very polarity of these forms make them mutually exclusive. Whether then a commodity assumes the relative form or the opposite equivalent form depends entirely upon its accidental position in the expression of values. That is, upon whether it is the commodity whose value is being expressed or the commodity in which value is being expressed. 2. The relative form of value, the nature and import of this form. In order to discover how the elementary expression of the value of a commodity lies hidden in the value relation of two commodities, we must in the first place consider the latter entirely apart from its quantitative aspect. The usual mode of procedure is generally the reverse, and in the value relation, nothing is seen but proportion between definitive quantities of two different sorts of commodities that are considered equal to each other. It is apt to be forgotten that the magnitude of different things can be compared quantitatively. Only when those magnitudes are expressed in terms of the same unit, it is an expression of such a unit that they are of the same denomination and therefore consumable. Whatever 20 yards of linen equal one coat, or 20 yards of coats, 20 coats equals X coats. That is, whether a given quantity of linen, I read it right, are expressions of the same unit, things of the same kind. Linen equal coat is the basis of the equation, but two commodities whose identity of quality is thus assumed do not play the same part. It is only the value of linen that is expressed, and how? By its reference to the coat as its equivalent as something to be exchanged for it. In this relation, the coat's mode of existence of value is the value embodied, from only as such is the same as the linen. On the other hand, the linen's own value comes to the front, receives independent expression, for it is only as being value that is comparable with the coat as a thing of equal value or exchangeable with the coat. To borrow an illustration from chemistry, acid is a different subject from formate, yet are made of the same chemical substance, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That too is proportion, namely C4H8O2 from now will be equated to butyric acid 2 formate. Then in the first place, formate would be in this relation merely a form of existence of C4H8O2, and in the second place we should be stating that butyric acid also consists of C4H8O2. Therefore, by thus equating the two substances, expression would be given to their chemical composition, while their different physical forms would be neglected. If we say that as values, commodities are merely conglomerations of human labor, we reduce them to our analysis. It is true to abstraction value, and we ascribe to this value no form apart from their bodily form. It is otherwise in the value relation of one commodity to another. Here, the one stands forth in its character of value by reason of its relation to another. By making the coat the equivalent of the linen, we equate the labor embodied in the former to that in the latter. Now, it is true that the tailoring which makes the coat is concrete labor of different sort from the weaving which makes linen, but the act of equating it to weaving reduces that tailoring that to which is really equal in two kinds of labor to their common character of labor in this roundabout way, then the fact is expressed that weaving also in so far as it weaves value has nothing to distinguish it from tailoring and consequently is abstract human labor. It is the expression of equivalence between different sorts of commodities that alone brings into relief the specific character of value creating labor, and this it does by actually reducing the different varieties of labor embodied in the different kinds of commodities to their common quality of human labor in the abstract. There is, however, something else required beyond the expression of specific character of the labor, of which the value of the linen consists. Human labor power in motion, or human labor creates value, but it is not itself value. It becomes value only in the collegiate state when embodied in the form of some object. In order to express the value of the linen as a conglomeration of human labor, that value must be expressed as having objective existence, as being of something materially different from it, the linen itself, and yet of something common to linen and all other commodities. The problem is already solved when occupying the position of equivalent in the equation of value. The coat ranks qualitatively as equal as the linen as something of the same kind, but it is value in the position. It is a thing in which we see nothing but value, or whose palpable bodily form represents value. Yet the coat itself, the coat of commodity, the coat is merely use value. A coat as such no more tells us its value than does the first piece of linen we take hold of. This shows that we place in value relation to the linen. The coat signifies more than we out of relation, just as many a men strutting about in gorgeous uniform counts from more than when it multiplies. All right. But though worn to a thread, it does not let this fact show through, and as equivalent of the linen in the value equation, it exists under the aspect alone, counts therefore as embodied value, as a body that is value. A, for instance, cannot be your majesty to be unless at the same time majesty is B's eyes assume the bodily form of A, and what is more, with every new fodder of the people changes its features, hair, and many other things besides it. Hence, in the value equation in which the coat is the equivalent of linen, the coat obfuscates as form of value. The value of the commodity, linen, is expressed by the bodily form of commodity. Coat the value of one by the use value of another. As use value of the linen is something palatable different from the coat, as value is it is the same as the coat and now has the appearance of a coat. Thus the linen acquires a value form different from its physical form. The fact that it is value is made manifest by its equality with the coat, just as the sheep of nature of a Christian who is shown his resemblance of the Lamb of God. We see then all that our analysis of value of commodities has already told us is by the linen itself. So as soon as it comes into communication with other commodities, the coat only it betrays its thoughts in the language which alone it is familiar, the language of commodities, in order to tell us that its own value is created by labor in its abstract character of human labor. It says that the coat, in so far as it's worth as much as linen, and therefore its value consists of the same human labor as the linen, in order to inform us that its sublime reality as value is not the same as Bankarat body. It says the value has the appearance of a coat, and consequently that so far as the linen is value, it and the coat are like two peas in a pod. May I add an ad lib? We may remark that the language of commodities has, besides Hebrew, many other more or less correct dialects. The German, to be worth, for instance, expresses a less striking manner, but the Romance verbs value that equating a commodity B to commodity A is commodity A's own mode of expression, its value, Paris, Viet, whatever it says in French, by means, therefore, of the value relation expressed in our equation, the bodily form of commodity B becomes the value form of commodity A, or the body of commodity B acts as a mirror to the value of commodity A. By putting itself in relation with commodity B as value, it is person as the matter of which human labor is made up. The commodity A converts the value in use to B into substance in which expressed it is as own of value. The value of A, thus expressed in the value of B, has taken the form of relative value. B. Quantitative determination of relative value. Every commodity whose value is its intended to express is a useful object of given quantity, as 15 bushels of corn or 100 pounds of coffee, and a given quantity of any commodity contains a definitive quantity of human labor. The value form must therefore not only express value generally, but also value in a definitive quantity. Therefore, in the value relation of a commodity A to commodity B of the linen to be coat, not only is the latter as value in general made of equal in quality of the linen, but a definitive coat, one coat, is made the equivalent of a definitive quantity, 20 yards of linen. The equation 20 yards of linen equal one coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth one coat, implies the same quantity of value substance. Collegiate labor is embodied in both, that two commodities have each cost the same of labor of the same quantity of labor time, but the labor time necessary for the production of 20 yards of linen or one coat varies with every single change in productiveness of weaving or tailoring. We now to consider the influence such as changes of quantitative aspect of the relative expression of value. Let the value of the linen vary, that of the coat remaining constant. If, say, in consequence of the exhaustion of flocks growing in soil, the labor time necessary for the production of linen be doubled, the value of linen will also be doubled. Instead of the equation 20 yards of linen equal one coat, we should have 20 yards of linen equal two coats, since one coat would now only contain half the labor time embodied in 20 yards of linen. If, on the other hand, in consequence, say, of improved looms, the labor time be reduced by one half, the value of linen would fall by one half. Consequently, we should have 20 yards of linen equal half a coat. Relative value of commodity A, i.e., the value expressed in commodity B rises and falls directly as the value A, the value B being supposed constant. 2. Let the value of linen remain constant while the value of the coat varies. If under these circumstances, in consequence, for instance, of a poor crop of wool, the labor time necessary for the production of a coat becomes doubled, we have, instead of 20 yards of linen equal one coat, 20 yards of linen equal half a coat. If, on the other hand, the value of the coat sinks by one half, then 20 yards of linen equal two coats. Hence, if the value of a commodity A remains constant, it is relative value expressed commodity B rises and falls inversely as the value of B. If we compare the differences in cases 1 and 2, we see the same changes of magnitude in relative value may arise for totally opposite causes. Thus, the equation 20 yards of linen equal one coat becomes 20 yards of linen equal two coats, either because the value of the linen has doubled, or because the value of the coat has fallen by one half and it becomes 20 yards of linen equal half a coat, either because the value of the linen has fallen by one half, or because the value of the coat has doubled. 3. Let the quantities of labor time respectively necessary for the production of linen and the coat vary simultaneously in the same direction and in the same proportion. In this case, 20 yards of linen continue equal to one coat. However much their values may be altered, their change of value is seen as soon as they are compared with a third commodity whose value has remained constant. If the value of all commodities rose or fell simultaneously and in the proportion, their relative values would remain unaltered. Their real change of value would appear from the diminished or increased quantity of commodities produced in a given time. 4. The labor time respectively necessary for the production of linen and a coat. Therefore, the value of the commodities may simultaneously vary in the same direction, but at unequal rates, or in opposite directions, or in other ways. The effects of all these possible different variations on the relative value of a commodity may be deduced from results 1, 2, and 3. Thus, real changes in the magnitude of value are neither unequivocal nor exhaustively reflected in their relative expression. That is, the equation expressing the magnitude of relative value. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although in its remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies, and simultaneously, variations in its magnitude of value and that of its relative expression by no means necessarily corresponds in amount. 3. The equivalent form of value. We have seen the commodity A, the linen, by expressing its value in use value of a commodity. Differing in kind, the coat at the same time impresses upon the latter a specific form of value, namely that of the equivalent. The commodity linen manifests its quality of having a value by the fact that the coat, without having assumed a value form different from its bodily form, is equated to the linen. The fact that the latter therefore has a value is expressed by saying that the coat is directly exchangeable with it. Therefore, when we say that a commodity is the equivalent form, we express the fact that it is directly exchangeable with other commodities. When one commodity, such as a coat, serves as the equivalent of another, such as linen, and the coat consequently acquire the characteristics property of being directly exchangeable with linen, we are far from knowing in what proportion the two are exchangeable. The values of linen being given in magnitude, the proportions dependent on the value of linen of the coat, whether the coat serves as the equivalent and the linen as relative value, or as the linen as the equivalent or the coat as the relative. The magnitude of the coat's value is determined independently of its value formed by the labor time necessary from its production. But whether the coat assumes in the equation of labor the position of equivalent is value acquires no quantitative expression. On the contrary, the commodity coat now figures only as a definitive quantity of some article. For instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats. But that commodity here plays the part of equivalent. But the use value coat, as opposed to the linen, figures as the embodiment of value. Therefore, a definitive number of coats suffices to express the definitive quantity of the value in the linen. 2 coats may therefore express the quantity of value of 40 yards of linen, but they can never express the quantity of their value alone. A superficial observation of this fact, namely that in the equation of value, the equivalent figures exclusively as a simple quantity of some article of some use value, has misled Bailey, as also many other, but before and after him, into seeing in the expression of value merely a quantitative relation, the truth being that a commodity as equivalent, not quantitative determination of its value, is expressed. The first peculiarity that strikes us in considering the form of the equivalent is the use value becomes the form of manifestation, the phenomenal form of its opposite value. The bodily form, the commodity, becomes its value form, but mark well that this quid pro exists in the case of any commodity B only when some other commodity A enters into a value relation with it, and only within the limits of its relation, since no commodity can stand in the relation of equivalent to itself and thus turn its own bodily shape into expressions of its own value. Every commodity is compelled to choose some other commodity for its equivalent and accept the use value that it says. The bodily shape of the other commodity as the form of its own value. One of the measures that we apply to commodities as material substances use values will serve to illustrate this point. A sugar loaf being a body is heavy and therefore has weight, but we never see nor touch this weight. We can take these various pieces of iron whose weight has been determined beforehand. The iron is no more a form of manifestation of weight than its sugar loaf. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as so much weight, we put it into a weight relation with the iron. In this relation, the iron obfuscates as the body representing nothing but weight. A certain quantity of iron therefore serves as the measure of weight of the sugar and represents in relation of the sugar loaf. Weight embodied the form of manifestation of weight. This part is played by the iron only within this relation into which the sugar or any other body whose weight has to be determined enters with the iron. Where they both not heavy, they could not enter in this relation, and the one could therefore not serve as the expression of weight of the other. When we throw both into scales, we see in reality that as weight they are both the same, and that therefore when taken in proper proportion they have some of the same weight, just as the substance as the measure of weight represented in relation of the sugar loaf weighs alone. As in our expression of value, the material object coat in relation to linen represents value alone. Here, however, the analogy ceases. The iron in the expression of weight of the sugar loaf represents a natural property common to both, namely their weight, but the coat in expression of the value of the linen represents a non-natural property of both, something purely social, namely their value. Since the relative form of value of a commodity, the linen, for example, expresses the value of the commodity as something wholly different from its substance and properties, as being, for instance, coat-like. We see that this expression in itself indicates that some social relation lies at the bottom of it, with the equivalent from its just contrary. The very essence of this form is that the material commodity itself, the coat, just as its expression of endowed with the form of value by nature itself. Of course, this holds goods only as long as the value relation exists, in which the coat stands in position of equivalence to the linen. Since, however, the properties of a thing are not the result of its relation to another thing, but only manifests themselves in relation, the coat seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of being directly exchangeable just as much by nature as it is endowed with the property of being heavy or capacity to keep us warm. Hence the magical character of equivalent form, which escapes the notices of the bourgeois politic communist until the form completely developed conforms him in the shape of money. He then seeks to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver by substituting from them less dazzling commodities, and by reciting with ever renewed satisfaction the catalogue of all possible commodities which at one time or another have played the part of equivalent. He has not least suspicion that the most simple expression of value, such as 20 yards of linen equal one coat, already propounds the riddle of equivalent forms of our solutions. The body of commodity that serves as the equivalent figures as the materialization of human labor in the abstract, and is at the same time the product of some specifically useful concrete labor. This concrete labor becomes therefore the medium of expression for expression, abstract human labor. If, on the other hand, the coat ranks as nothing but the embodiment of abstract human labor, so on the other hand, tailoring, which is actually embodying in it, counts as nothing but the form under which the abstract labor is realized. In the expression of labor of the linen, the utility of the tailoring consists not in making the clothes, but in making an object which we at once recognize to be value, and therefore the conglomeration of value, but value indistinguishable from the relation indistinguishable from that realized in value of linen. In order to act as such a mirror of value, the labor of tailoring must reflect nothing besides its own abstract quality of being human labor generally, and tailoring as well as weaving human labor power is expanded. Both therefore possess the general property of being human labor, and may therefore in certain cases such as production of value have to be considered under this aspect alone. There is nothing mysterious in it, but in expressions of value there is a complete turn of tables. For instance, how is this fact to be expressed that weaving creates the value of linen, not by virtue of weaving, such as by reason and general property of being human labor, simply by opposing to weaving the other particular form of concrete labor, in this instance tailoring, which produces the equivalent of producing of weaving, just as the coat is its bodily form because a direct expression, so now does tailoring, a concrete form of labor, appeared as the direct and palpable embodiment of human labor generally. Hence, the peculiarity of equivalent form is the Hence, the second peculiarity of the equivalent form is that concrete labor becomes the form under which its opposite, abstract human labor, manifests itself. But because this concrete labor tailoring in our case ranks us as and is directly identified with undetermined human labor, it also ranks as identical with other sorts of labor, and therefore with that embodied in linen. Consequently, although like all other commodities producing labor, it is the labor of private individuals, yet at the same time it ranks as labor directly social in its character. This is the reason why it results in a product directly exchangeable with other commodities. We have then a third peculiarity of equivalent form, namely that the labor of private individuals takes the form of its opposite, labor directly social in its form. The two latter peculiarities of the equivalent form will become more intelligible if we go back to the greater thinker who was the first to analyze so many forms, whether of the thought, society, or nature, and amongst them also the form of value. I mean Aristotle. In the first place, he clearly inoculates the money form of commodities is only the future further development of simple form of value, i.e., the expression of the value of one commodity and some other commodity takes at randomly. He says for 5 beds equal 1 house is not to be distinguished from 5 beds equals so much money. He further sees that the value relation which gives rise to the expression makes it necessary that the house should qualitatively be made equal of the beds, and that without such an equalization, these two clearly different things cannot be compared with each other as consumable qualities. Exchange, he says, cannot take place without equality, and equality not without consumability. Here, however, he comes to a stop and gives up the further analysis of the form of value. It is, however, in reality impossible that such unlike things can be consumable, i.e., qualitatively equal, such as equalization can only be something foreign to their nature, consequently only a makeshift for particular purpose. Aristotle therefore himself tells us what barred the way of his further analysis is the absence of any concept of value. What is the equal of something? The common substance which admits of the value of beds being expressed by a house. Such a thing in truth cannot exist, says Aristotle, and why not? Compared with the beds, the house does represent something equal to them in so far as it represents what is really equal both in the beds and the house, and that is human labor. There was, however, an important fact which prevented Aristotle from seeing that to attribute value to commodities is merely a mode of expression. All labor as equal human labor, and consequently as labor of equal quality. Greek society was founded upon slavery and had therefore for its natural basis, the inequality of men and of their labor power, the secret of expression of value, namely that all kinds of labor are equal and equivalent because and so far as they are human labor in general cannot deciphered be deciphered until the notion of human equality has already acquired the fixity. Okay. Be deciphered be deciphered until the notion of human equality has already acquired the fixity of a popular prejudice. This, however, is possible only in a society in which the great mass of produce of labor takes the form of commodities, in which consequently the dominant relation between man and man is that of owners of commodities. The brilliancy of Aristotle's genius is shown by this alone, that he discovered in the expression of the value of commodities a relation of equality. The peculiar commodities of the society in which he lived alone prevented him from discovering what in truth was at the bottom of this equality. 4. The elementary form of value considered as a whole. The elementary form of value of a commodity is contained in the equation expressing its relation to another commodity of a different kind, or in this exchange relation to the same. The value of commodity A is qualitatively expressed by the fact that commodity B is directly exchangeable with it. Its value is qualitatively expressed by the fact that a definitive quantity of B is exchangeable with a definitive quantity of A. In other words, the value of commodity obtains a dependent and definitive expression by taking the form of exchange value. When at the beginning of this chapter we said in common parlance that a commodity is both a use value and exchangeable value, we were accurately speaking wrong. A commodity is a use value or object of utility and a value. It manifests as this twofold thing that it is as soon as its value assumed an independent form, viz. The form of exchange value. It never assumed this form when isolated, but only when placed in a value or exchange relation with another commodity of a different kind. Once we notice such a mode of expression does not harm, it simply serves as an abbreviation. Our analysis has shown that the form or expression of the values of a commodity originates in the nature of value, and not that the value and its magnitude originates in the mode of their expression as exchange value. This, however, is delusion as well as mercantilism at their recent receivers, Ferrier, Granhold, and others, as also their antipodes. The modern bagman of free trade, such as Bastiat, the mercantilist, lay special stress on qualitatively aspects of expression of value and consequently on the equivalent form of commodities, which attains its full perfection in money. The modern hawkers of free trade, who must get rid of their article at any price, on the other hand, lay most stress on quantities aspect of relative form of value. For them, there consequently exists neither value nor magnitude of value anywhere except in the expression by means of exchange relations of commodities, that is, in daily list of prices. Current McCall, who has taken upon himself to dress up the confused ideas of Street in the more learned fencery, is a successful cross between superstitious materialist, mercantilist, and enlightened free trade bagman, a close security of the expression of the value of A in terms of B contained in the expression. An equation expressing the value relation of A to B has shown us that within the relation the bodily form of A figures only as a use value, the bodily form of B only as form or proper aspect or aspect of value, the opposite or constant existing internally in each commodity between use value and value is therefore made evident eternally by two commodities being placed in such relation to each other that the commodity whose value is sought to be expressed figures directly as a mere use value, while the commodity in which the value is expressed figures directly as merely exchange value. Hence, the elementary form of value of a commodity is the elementary form in which the contrast contained in that commodity between use value and value becomes apparent. Every product of labor is in all states of society a use value, but it is only at a definitive historic epoch in a society developed that such a product becomes a commodity, viz. At the epoch when the labor spent on the production of a useful article becomes expressed as one of the objective qualities of that article, i.e., as its value. It therefore follows that the elementary value form is also a primitive form under which a product of labor appears historically as a commodity, and that the gradual transformation of such products into commodities proceeds pari passu with the development of the value form. We perceive at first sight the defiance of elementary form of value. It is a mere germ which must undergo a series of metamorphoses before it can ripen into price form. The expression of value of commodity A in terms of any other commodity B merely distinguishes the value from the use value of A, and therefore places them merely in a relation of exchange with a single different commodity B, but it is still far from expressing A's qualitatively equality and quantitative proportionality to all commodities. To the elementary relative value form of a commodity there corresponds a single equivalent form of one other commodity. Thus, in the relative expression of value of the linen, the coat assumes the form of equivalent or the directly exchangeable only in relation to a single commodity, the linen. Nevertheless, the elementary form of value passes by an easy transaction into a more complete form. It is true that by means of elementary form, the value of a commodity A becomes expressed in terms of one and only other commodities, but that one may be a commodity of any kind, coat, iron, corn, or anything else. Therefore, according A is placed in relation with one or the other, we get for one and the same commodity different elementary expressions of value. The number of such possible expression is limited only by the number of the different kinds of commodities distinct from it. The isolated expression of A's value is therefore convertible into a series prolonged to any length of different elementary expressions. B. Total or expanded forms labor. Com A equals, I think it's just algebra. 20 yards linen equal 1 coat. 20 yards linen equal 10 pounds of tea. 20 yards linen equal 40 pounds of coffee. 20 yards linen equal quarter corn. 20 yards linen equal 2 ounces of gold. 20 yards linen equal half a ton of iron. 20 yards linen equal etc. 1. The expanded relative form of value. The value of a single commodity, the linen for example, is now expressed in terms of numberless other elements of the world of commodities. Every other commodity now becomes a mirror of the linen's value. It is thus that for the first time the value shows itself in its true light as a conglomeration of undifferentiated human labor. For the labor that creates it now stands expressly revealed as labor that ranks equally with every other sort of human labor, no matter what its form, whether tailoring, ploughing, mining, and etc., and no matter therefore whether it is realized in coats, corn, iron, or gold. The linen, by virtue of the form of its value, now stands in celestial relation no longer with only other kinds of commodity, but with the whole world of commodities. As a commodity, it is a citizen of the world. A commodity at the time it is interminable, serious, equation implies that as regard the value of commodities, it is a matter of indifference under what particular form or kind or use value it appears. In the first form, 20 yards linen equal one coat. It might, for aught that otherwise appeared to be pure accident, that these two commodities are exchangeable in definitive quantities in the form of one contrary. We perceive at once the background that determines and is essentially different form. This accidental appearance, the value of the linen remains unaltered in magnitude, whether expressed in coke, coffee, or iron, or in numberless different commodities. The property of as many different owners, the accidental relation between two identical commodity owners disappears. It becomes plain that it is not the exchange of commodities which regulates the magnitude of their value, but on the contrary, that is the magnitude of their value which controls their expression. It controls their exchange proportions. Two, particular equivalent form. Each commodity, such as coat, tea, corn, iron, etc., figures in the expression of value of the linen as equivalent and consequently as the thing that is value. The bodily form of each of these commodities figures now a particular equivalent form, one out of many. In the same way, the manifold concrete useful kinds of labor embodied in these different commodities rank now as many different forms of the realization or manifestation or undifferentiated human labor. 3. The effects of the total or expanded form of value. In the first place, the relative expression of value is incomplete because the series representing it is interminable. The chain of which equation of value is linked is liable at moment to be lengthened by each new kind of commodity that comes into existence and furnish the material for a fresh experience of value. In the second place, it is a many-colored mosaic of disparate and independent expressions. And lastly, if as must to be the case, the relative value of each commodity is turned becomes expressed in this expanded form, we get for each of them a relative value form different in every case and consisting of an interminable series of expressions of value. The defects of expanded relative value form are reflected in the corresponding equivalent form, since the bodily form of each single commodity is one particular equivalent form amongst numberless other. We have on the whole nothing but fragmentary equivalent forms, each excluding the other. In the same way, also the special, concrete, useful kind of labor embodied in which particular equivalent is presented only as a particular kind of labor, and therefore not as an exhaustible representative of human labor generally. The latter indeed gains adequate manifestation in the totality of its manifold particular concrete forms, but in that case its expressions is an infinite series, is ever incomplete and deficient in unity. The expanded relative value form is, however, nothing but the sum of elementary relative expressions or equations of the first kind, such as 20 yards later linen equal one coat, 20 yards of linen equal 10 pounds of tea, etc. Each of these implies the correspondingly inverted equations. One coat equals 20 yards of linen, 10 pounds of tea equals 20 yards of linen, etc. In fact, when a person exchanges his linen for many other commodities and thus expresses its value in a series of other commodities, it necessarily follows the various owners of the latter exchange them for the linen, and consequently express the value of their various commodities in one and the same third commodity, the linen. If then we reverse the series, 20 yards linen equal 1 coat or 10 pounds of tea, etc. It is to say, if we give expressions to the converse relation already implied in this series, we get 1 coat, 10 pounds of tea, 10 pounds of coffee, 1/4, 2 ounces of gold, 1 ton of iron. Commodity A equals 20 yards linen. The altered character of the form of value. 1. All commodities now express the value in an elementary form because in a single commodity with unity becomes in one and the same commodity. This form of value is elementary and the same for all, therefore general. The forms A and B were fit only to express the value of a commodity as something distinct from its use value or material form. This first form furnishes such as equations as the following: 1 coat equal 20 yards of linen, 10 pounds of tea, 1/2 of ton of iron. The value of the coat is equated to linen, that of tea to iron, but to be equated to linen and again to iron is to be as different as are linen and iron. This form is plain occurs particularly only in the first beginning, when the products of labor are converted into commodities by accidental and occasional exchanges. The second form, B, distinguishes in a more adequate manner than the first the value of commodity from its use value, for the value of a coat is there placed in contrast under all possible shapes with the bodily form of a coat, is equated to linen, to iron, to tea, in short, to everything else, only not to itself. The coat, on the other hand, any general expression of value common to all, is directly excluded from in the equation of value of each commodity. All other commodities now appear only under the form of equivalents. The expanded form of value comes into actual existence for the first time as soon as particular product of labor, such as cattle, is no longer exponentially but habitually exchanged for various other commodities. The third and lastly developed form of expression, the value of the whole world of commodities in terms of a single commodity set apart from the purpose, namely the linen, and thus represents to us their value by means of their equity with linen. The value of every commodity is now, by being equated to linen, not only differentiated from its own use value, but from its other's use value generally, and is by the very fact expressed as the which is common to all commodities. By this form, commodities are for the first time efficiently brought into relation with another as values, or made to appear as exchange values. The two earlier forms there expressed the value of a commodity in terms of a single commodity of a different kind, or in a series of many such commodities. In both cases, it is the special business of each single commodity to find an expression for its value, and this does without the help of the others with respect to the former play the passive parts of equivalence. The general form of value, C, represents the joint action of the whole world of commodities, and from that alone a commodity can acquire a general expression of its value only by all other commodities simultaneously with it expressing the value in equivalent, and every new commodity must follow suit. It thus becomes evident that since the existence of commodities as value is purely social, this social existence can be expressed by the totality of social relations alone, and consequently that the form of their value must be a socially recognized form. All commodities being equated to linen now appear not only as qualitatively equal as values generally, but also as values whose magnitude are capable of comparison by expressing the magnitude of their values in one and the same. The linen magnitudes also compared with those, for instance, 10 pounds of tea equals 20 yards of linen, and 40 pounds of coffee equals 20 yards of linen. Therefore, 10 pounds of tea equal 40 pounds of linen. In other words, it is contained in 1 pound of tea only one fourth as much substance of value, labor, as contained in 1 pound of tea. The general form of relative value embracing the whole world commodities converts the single commodity that is excluded from the rest and made to play the part of equivalent, here the linen, into the universal equivalent. The bodily form of linen is now the form assumed in common by the values of all commodities. It therefore becomes directly exchangeable with all and every of them. The particular substance in linen becomes the visible incarnation, the social catalyst state, chrysalis state of every kind of human labor weaving, which is the labor of certain private individuals producing a particular article. Linen acquires in consequence a social character, the character of equality with all other kinds of labor, the innumerable equation of which the general form of value is composed. Equate in turn the labor embodied in linen that embodied in every other commodity, and they thus convert weaving into a general form of manifestation of undefinitive human labor. In this manner, the labor realized in the values of commodities is presented not only under negative aspect, under which abstraction is made from every concrete form and useful property of actual work, but its own positive nature is made to reveal itself expressly. The general value form is the reduction of all kinds of actual labor to their common character of being human labor, generally of being the expenditure of human labor power. The general value form, which represents all products of labor as merely congregations of undefinitive human labor, shows by its very structure that it is a social resume of world of commodities, that from consequently makes it indisputable evident that in the world of commodities the character possessed by all labor of being human labor constitutes its specific social character. To the interdependent development of relative form of value and of the equivalent form, the degree of development of the relative form of value corresponds to that of the equivalent form, but we must bear in mind that the development of latter is only expressed and a result of development of the further. The primary or isolated relative form of value of one commodity converts some other commodity into isolated equivalent. The expanded form of relative value, which is expression of the value of one commodity, is in terms of all other commodities, and bow therefore other commodities which the character of particular equivalent differing in kind. And lastly, a particular kind of commodity acquires the character of universal equivalent because all other commodities make it the material in which they uniformly express their value. The antagonistic between the relative form of value and the equivalent form, the two poles of the value form, is developed concurrently with the form itself. The first form, 20 yards linen equal 1 coat, already contains this antagonism without as yet fixing it. According as we read the equation forwards or backwards, the parts played by the linen and the coat are different. In the one case, the relative value of the linen expressed in the coat. In the other case, the relative value of the coat is expressed in the linen. And the first of the value, therefore, is difficult to grasp the polar contrast. Form B shows that one single commodity at a time can be completely expanded in relative value, and that it acquires this expenditure form only because and in so far as all other commodities are with respect to it equivalent. Here we cannot reserve the equation as we can the equation of 20 yards of linen 1 coat equal 1 coat without altering the general character and conveying it from the expand form of value into the general form of value. Finally, the form C gives the world of commodities the general society relative of value because and insofar as thereby all commodities with the expectation of one are excluded from the equivalent form a commodity, the linen appeared therefore to have acquired the character of direct exchangeability, whether every other commodity because and insofar as this character is denied to every other commodity, the commodity that figures as universal equivalent is on the other hand excluded from the relative value form. If the linen or any other commodity serving as universal equivalent were at the same time to share in relative form of value, it would have to serve as its own equivalent. We should have then 20 yards of linen equal 20 yards of linen. This uh, autoludes expression neither value nor magnitude of value. In order to express the relative value of the universal equivalent, we must rather reverse the form C. This equivalent has no relative form of value in common with other commodities, but value is relative expressed by a never-ending series of commodities. Thus, the expanded form of relative value of or form B now shows itself as specific form of relative value from the equivalent commodity. 3. Transaction from the general form of value of money form. The universal equivalent from is a form of value in general. It can therefore be assumed by any commodity. On the other hand, if a commodity be found to be assured the universal equivalent form C, this only because and insofar as it has excluded from the rest of all other commodities as their equivalent, and that by their own act and from the moment that is exclusion because finally restricted to one particular commodity from that moment only, the general form of relative value of the world of commodities obtains real consistence and general social viability. The particular commodity whose bodily form the equivalent form is thus socially identified now becomes the money commodity or serves as money. It becomes it becomes a special social function of commodity, and consequently its social monopoly to play with the world of commodities, the part of the universal equivalent amongst the commodities which in Form B figures as particular equivalent of the linen, and in Form C express in common their relative values in linen, and for most place has been attained by one particular, namely gold. If then in Form C we replace the linen by gold, we get D, the money form. 20 yards of linen equal 20 yards of linen, 1 coat, 10 T, 40, it all equals 2 ounces of gold. In passing from Form A to Form B and the latter to Form C, the changes are fundamental. On the other hand, there is no difference between Form C and D except that in the latter, gold has assumed the equivalent form in the place of linen. Gold is in Form D what linen was in Form C, the universal equivalent. The progress consistent in this alone, that the character of direct and universal exchangeability, in other words, the universal equivalent form has now, by social custom, become finally identified with the substance gold. Gold is now money with reference to all other commodities only because it was previously with reference to them a simple commodity. Like all other commodities, it was also capable of serving as equivalent, either as simple equivalent in isolated exchanges or as particular equivalent by the side of others. Greatly it served within varying limits as universal equivalent. So soon as it monopolized this position in the expression of value from the world of commodities, it becomes the money of commodity, and then and not till then does D become distinct from the form C, and the general form of value becomes the change into the money form. The elementary expression of relative value of a single commodity, such as linen, in terms of commodities such as gold, that plays the part of commodity is the price form of commodity. The price form of the linen is therefore 20 yards of linen equal 2 ounces of gold, or if 2 ounces of gold was when coined are $2, 20 yards of linen equal $2. Difficulty in forming a concept of the money form consists in clearly comprehending the universal equivalent form as a necessary corollary. The general form of value from Form C, the latter is deducible from Form B. The expanded form of value, the essential component element of which we saw is form A, 20 yards linen equal 1 co, or X commodity A equal Y commodity B. The simple commodity form is therefore the germ of the money form.